Harlem's finest had gathered under the chandelier ceiling, wallet's thick, ego's thicker. Dutch Schultz smirked, thinking money could buy anything, even fear. Across the room, Bumpy Johnson leaned back, calm as a cat in the sun, eyes locked on the canvas. 60 seconds later, the auctioneer's pleas would echo through the hall. The year was 1935, and Harlem buzzed with its usual chaos, jazz spilling from the clubs, heels clicking on cobblestones, and whispers of deals both legal and lethal. Bumpy Johnson, already a name whispered with caution in every alley and speakeasy, strode through the streets like he owned every brick. His reputation wasn't just built on muscle, it was built on precision, patience, and the kind of cold calculation that made rivals sweat without a single gun fired. Tonight, Bumpy wasn't hunting gangs or settling scores. He had come for something far more delicate. A painting rumored to be priceless, hidden behind velvet ropes in a private auction hall. Schultz, greedy and volatile, had caught wind of it too. Where Bumpy was quiet and measured, Dutch Schultz was brash, a man who used intimidation like perfume. Their paths crossing tonight promised sparks, and in Harlem, sparks often meant fire. The auction house smelled of polished wood and cigar smoke, the air thick with anticipation. Collectors in bow ties and flapper dresses whispered about the painting's origin, unaware that two of the most dangerous men in the city had just entered. Bumpy's eyes scanned the room, reading faces as easily as pages in a ledger. Dutch Schultz waved a hand at the clerk, showing off the thickness of his wallet. The crowd chuckled nervously, sensing the tension before they understood it. Bumpy didn't flinch. He wasn't there to win with charm or cash. He was there to send a message. One painting, one room, and two men who believed power could be measured in dollars. By the end of the night, only one would walk out holding the truth. Bumpy stepped into the auction hall, his polished shoes silent on the marble floor, but his presence louder than any shout. Every eye in the room subtly shifted, sensing something dangerous had entered. Dutch Schultz, already perched near the front, didn't notice at first. He was busy flashing cash and smirking, leaning against the velvet ropes like the king of the evening. But Bumpy's gaze found him instantly. The air between them snapped taut like a wire about to break. The painting, an exquisite canvas framed in gold, hung on the far wall, almost glowing under the soft chandelier lights. It wasn't just art, it was a symbol of status, of power, and tonight it had become a battleground. Collectors murmured about its value, but none understood that the real stakes weren't money. They were survival, respect, and fear. The first bids started, small, cautious, polite, merely rituals to warm up the room. Bumpy raised his paddle slowly, almost lazily. Schultz noticed immediately, his smile faltering. The whispers began. "That's Bumpy Johnson," someone said. "Don't let him near the painting." Schultz waved it off, sure that his money and reputation could outweigh any Harlem legend. As the bids climbed, tension coiled like a snake. Schultz raised his paddle higher, sneering at Bumpy. The crowd held its breath. Bumpy's eyes didn't flicker, he didn't shout, he didn't raise his voice. But the room felt his presence, the kind that made your skin crawl without touching it. A bead of sweat formed on Schultz's forehead. He was used to dominating markets, mobsters, and men with itchy triggers. But Bumpy was different. The auctioneer, a man whose hands were shaking before he even began the final bids, tried to keep control. "Do I hear 100,000? 150?" His voice cracked under the weight of the room's silent tension. Schultz's paddle went up, loud and aggressive. He wanted to humiliate Bumpy, to show that dollars could buy supremacy. Bumpy raised his paddle slightly, just enough for the auctioneer and everyone else to notice. A ripple of shock moved through the hall. Schultz's smirk faltered. "You don't want this," he muttered under his breath. more to himself than anyone else. But Bumpy's calm gaze met his, unwavering, unshakable, and something in Schultz's chest tightened. The beats kept climbing. The crowd, sensing the invisible battle, leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away. Every eye followed the silent war between two men who didn't need words to communicate threats. Sweat, tension, pride, and history hung in the air. In that moment, the painting became secondary. The real spectacle was power in its rawest form. Bumpy didn't speak. Schultz barked a few tones, trying to provoke, trying to unnerve. But Bumpy's stillness was heavier than any gun or fist. 1 minute felt like an hour. Every tick of the clock, every whispered murmur, every rustle of a silk dress heightened the suspense. Harlem had never seen a duel like this. One of money, ego, and lethal calm. And tonight, it would decide who commanded fear in the room. The auctioneer's voice trembled as he announced the next bid. 200,000. 250. The numbers ricocheted through the hall like a gunshot. Dutch Schultz slammed his paddle down with a flourish, a smirk plastered across his face. 300. He barked, eyes flashing with arrogance. The room stiffened, sensing the storm brewing. Bumpy Johnson leaned back in his chair, hands folded, calm as a shadow. His eyes never left Schultz. He didn't raise his paddle immediately. He didn't have to. The auctioneer hesitated, heart hammering in his chest. The crowd leaned forward, every whisper and shuffle a drumbeat in the tension-filled hall. Bumpy's silence screamed louder than any shout. Schultz's smirk faltered for the first time. His ego demanded domination, yet something in Bumpy's stare made him pause. He wanted to shout, to intimidate, to make Bumpy back down, but he couldn't. That unflinching gaze, steady as a blade, made Schultz's bravado wobble. He tried to throw a quip. What? You're too cheap to bid, Johnson? The words came out sharp, but Bumpy didn't respond. The auctioneer swallowed hard. 350. Do I hear 400? His voice shook. Schultz's paddle went up again, louder, more desperate this time. The crowd gasped. Every eye in the room was locked on the two men. Harlem, both near and far, would have whispered about this for years. The energy was electric, charged with pride, danger, and the weight of unspoken threats. Bumpy finally raised his paddle, but not with haste. Slowly, deliberately. The room stiffened. The auctioneer's mouth opened and closed, silent. Schultz's hand twitched. He had thought he controlled the room. He had thought his money was the final word. But Bumpy's calm challenge was a storm, contained in a single gesture. A bead of sweat slid down Schultz's temple. He raised his paddle again, louder, more aggressive. 450. 500. He shouted, his voice cracking under tension. The room flinched at his outburst. Bumpy's eyes didn't leave him. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched Bumpy's lips. This wasn't just a painting. It was a test of nerve, patience, and dominance. And then it happened. A slow, deliberate movement. Bumpy's hand slipped inside his coat, fingers brushing the cold steel of the razor he always carried for moments exactly like this. No one in the room saw it at first, not even Schultz. But the air seemed to thicken, heavy with unspoken menace. A hush fell over the crowd, instinctively sensing that something had shifted. The auctioneer swallowed again, eyes darting between the two men. He had been trained to handle tension, but nothing could prepare him for this. Schultz, for all his bravado, felt the shift too. His smirk wavered, the swagger drained from his stance. The room had become a stage, and Bumpy was the silent predator commanding the spotlight. The next bid would not be about money. It would be about survival, control, and the unshakable fear that only Bumpy Johnson could evoke. One glance, one move, and everything could explode in an instant. Harlem had witnessed gunfights, heists, and beatings. But nothing like the quiet storm brewing in this auction hall. Time seemed to freeze. Bumpy's hand slid fully into his coat, and the cold steel of the razor caught a glint of chandelier light. The room didn't know it yet, but everything had changed. Schultz's confident smirk faltered. The crowd sensed it, instinctively leaning back, whispering, shuffling, everyone feeling the invisible weight in the room. The auctioneer's voice cracked as he stammered, we need to. Please, sir. His words trailed off. He had dealt with temperamental bidders before, but never with a man whose calm could slice through fear as sharply as Bumpy's blade could slice flesh. The paddle in Schultz's hand wavered. For a moment, arrogance met reality, and reality had fangs. Bumpy didn't shout. He didn't gesture. He just stood, slowly, deliberately, letting the silence speak. Every eye followed his movements. Schultz's bravado, so carefully constructed over years of violence and intimidation, began to crumble. A tiny bit of sweat formed at the corner of his eye. He had fought gangsters, politicians, and crooked cops, but never a man who could command an entire room with nothing but presence and a blade hidden in plain sight. Enough, Bumpy said, voice low but clear. The razor slid out of his coat with a soft whisper, catching the light. The auctioneer froze mid-breath, the paddle shaking in his hand. Schultz's lips parted, words dying before they left his mouth. The crowd felt it, a collective shiver, like electricity running through every nerve. Bumpy's gaze swept the room, calm yet lethal. He approached the auctioneer, slow, deliberate steps echoing against marble. "Do you value your life or the painting?" he asked, voice smooth as silk, yet sharp as steel. The man's knees nearly buckled. His fingers trembled as he tried to maintain control, but the fear was absolute. Schultz, standing near the front, swallowed hard. He realized, finally, that money couldn't protect him. Not tonight. In 60 seconds, the balance of power had shifted. The crowd, previously focused on the art, now watched a man bend reality with nothing more than patience, focus, and a razor. Whisper gasps spread like wildfire. Even Schultz, proud and dangerous, stepped back slightly. His ego had been bruised, his control evaporating. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. One small threat, one silent gesture, had done what years of intimidation never could. The auctioneer, pale and shaking, stammered out the final warning. I can't continue. Please, sir, put it away." Bumpy's razor gleamed in the soft light, calm in his hand. He nodded slightly, satisfied, and slid it back into his coat. Silence lingered like smoke. Schultz's eyes burned with fury and humiliation, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The room had learned a lesson in seconds. Fear, not wealth, dictated authority tonight. Bumpy returned to his seat, folding his hands as though nothing had happened. The crowd exhaled collectively. The painting, still untouched, was now secondary. Bumpy Johnson had spoken without words, cut through egos and greed, and left a message heavier than any bullet. Harlem had witnessed power in its rawest, most dangerous form, and nobody would forget it. Bumpy leaned back, folding his hands over the table, calm as ever. The auctioneer, still trembling, fumbled with the gavel, glancing nervously at Schultz. The room had gone silent, every breath measured. No one dared speak. Schultz, for all his money and threats, had lost control. Every eye in the hall told him the truth. Tonight, Bumpy Johnson had the final word. A murmur ran through the crowd, low at first, then louder, spreading like wildfire. Collectors and bidders, once fixated on the painting's value, now whispered about the man who didn't need to shout to command fear. The auctioneer cleared his throat and, hands shaking, gestured to Bumpy. It's yours. he stammered, barely above a whisper. Bumpy nodded once, accepting the canvas without ceremony. Schultz's face burned with humiliation. His paddle dropped. Every dollar in his wallet felt worthless, every boast meaningless. He had underestimated Bumpy's patience, his precision, and the quiet menace that could silence an entire room. Schultz had won battles before, but tonight he had lost to a man whose reputation was more than violence. It was mastery. Bumpy rose, the painting cradled carefully in his arms. The crowd parted instinctively, giving him space as though instinctively aware that any interruption could provoke consequences they didn't want to face. Harlem had seen tough men before, but Bumpy's combination of calm, intellect, and deadly readiness elevated him above every rival. Outside, the street buzzed with whispers. Word traveled fast. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a room dominated by Schultz, outbid and outmaneuvered him, not with cash, but with presence and razor-sharp timing. Every corner, every club, every alley discussed the incident in hush awe. Fear and respect intertwined, creating an aura of untouchable power around Bumpy. The painting, more than an object of beauty, became a symbol of control, of intelligence paired with courage, of authority that couldn't be bought. Those who thought wealth could command obedience realized too late that some men demanded allegiance by reputation alone. Bumpy had secured more than a canvas. He had reinforced a hierarchy, a silent decree of power in Harlem's underworld. Schultz retreated, sitting quietly, but conscious of the lesson he'd learned. Money was no longer enough. Arrogance could not protect him. And Bumpy? He walked through the auction hall like he owned every inch of it, a silent predator whose reputation grew heavier with every step. Harlem would talk for weeks, months, even years. One painting had decided the fate of a room full of power, and Bumpy Johnson had proven why he was untouchable. By the time the crowd dispersed, the echo of fear and awe lingered. Bumpy stepped into the night, painting carefully tucked under his arm, the city around him alive with whispers. Harlem had witnessed a rare truth. Some men didn't need violence to dominate. Sometimes, patience, presence, and precision were enough. And tonight, Bumpy Johnson was the undisputed master. Bumpy walked down the dimly lit streets of Harlem, the painting under his arm, the city alive with whispers. Every shadow seemed to bow to his presence, every step measured, deliberate. But this wasn't just about one auction. It was a reminder of why he was feared and respected, why Harlem bent subtly but surely under his influence. Memories of previous encounters flickered in his mind. There was the night he had confronted rival gangsters over a shipment of liquor, taking control without firing a single bullet. There was the time he had taught a corrupt police officer a lesson in humility. Slow, precise, unforgettable. Each victory, each calculated move had built the invisible fortress around his reputation. The razor tonight had been just another brushstroke in the portrait of power he had been painting for years. Meanwhile, Dutch Schultz's pride had been shattered. Even as he retreated into the shadows of his private clubs, his mind replayed every detail: the silent stare, the slight smirk, the subtle movement that revealed the razor. Schultz realized too late that fear couldn't be bought, and arrogance could not overpower presence. Money was weightless here. Authority was earned, carved with patience and precision. And tonight, Bumpy Johnson had carved it cleanly. Back at the auction house, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer sat stiffly, barely able to compose himself. Collectors and bystanders exchanged glances, still processing the spectacle. "That man," someone whispered. "He doesn't bluff. Ever." Eyes darted toward the exits, cautious, respectful, afraid to breathe too loudly. Bumpy's silent mastery had transformed a room full of the city's elite into an audience of witnesses to his power. Bumpy's calm exterior masked the storm of awareness he carried. He knew that in Harlem, power was as fragile as it was respected. One misstep, one spark of hubris, and rivals could rise. But tonight had been a statement. A single razor, a single glance, and the city had been reminded why he was untouchable. Every corner of Harlem that night, from the jazz clubs to the back alleys, would carry his legend forward. He paused outside a club, the glow of neon lights reflecting off the polished frame of the painting. People watched him walk, some with curiosity, others with fear, but all with recognition. Bumpy Johnson had just rewritten the rules. Schultz's shadow, though looming, had been diminished, replaced by the quiet inevitability of Bumpy's strategy. In Harlem, stories traveled fast, but truth traveled faster. By the next morning, the city would buzz with recounts of the auction, the razor, the silence, the fear, and the unmistakable calm of the man who had commanded it all. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to boast. He didn't need to strike. His victory wasn't measured by dollars, guns, or intimidation. It was measured in obedience, awe, and the unshakable certainty that he controlled more than just the painting. Tonight, Harlem learned a lesson that would echo for years. The man who walked quietly, carried steel, and commanded with calm precision was the man who truly ruled. And Bumpy Johnson had just reminded everyone why. The streets of Harlem were alive that night, buzzing with whispers that seemed to follow Bumpy wherever he went. Even as he strolled casually, the painting tucked securely under his arm, eyes followed him from shadowed corners, from jazz clubs, from alleyways where rival gangsters lurked. Every footstep carried a silent warning. This man was untouchable, but tension never fully disappeared. Bumpy knew the city was a living chessboard. One rival, one ambitious dog, could make a move. And though Schultz had retreated, the memory of humiliation lingered. Bumpy's mind replayed the auction in slow motion, the flicker of a smirk, the brief gleam of the razor, the way silence had bent an entire room to his will. Each detail reinforced the lesson that power could be precise, cold, and devastating without a single shot fired. Back at a nearby speakeasy, whispers ran wild. "Did you see him?" Someone murmured. "The way he just walked in, and Schultz didn't know what hit him." Patrons nodded, fear and admiration mingling in equal measure. Stories grew, exaggerated with each retelling, but the truth remained simple. Bumpy Johnson had dominated a room of the city's elite without raising his voice. A near miss reminded him of the stakes. From an alley, a shadow moved too quickly, a figure stepping toward him, perhaps testing limits, perhaps trying to make a mistake. Bumpy's hand instinctively brushed the handle of his razor, his eyes narrowing. But the man hesitated, recognized the calm in Bumpy's gaze, and retreated. No confrontation, no words, just a silent acknowledgement of authority that didn't need to be proven with violence. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate. Children playing in the streets paused, their parents whispering cautionary tales. Shopkeepers peeked from windows, nodding knowingly. Word traveled fast in Harlem, but it carried weight tonight. Fear, respect, awe, all combined to form an invisible perimeter around Bumpy. Every corner, every club, every alley carried the story. The man who commanded with a razor and a glance had just reminded the city who truly ruled. Even Schultz's men felt the shift. Rumors of the night's events spread through his inner circle. Some were enraged, some were terrified, all were wary. Money could no longer dictate terms. Arrogance could no longer intimidate. The streets had spoken, and the verdict was unanimous. Bumpy Johnson had rewritten the rules of power in Harlem. By the time the moon hung high above the city, the tension had settled into an uneasy respect. Bumpy, calm as ever, walked past the clubs and the crowds, his presence alone shaping the night. He didn't need celebration. He didn't need recognition. His victory was measured not in applause, but in the silent fear and reverence that followed him everywhere. Harlem had witnessed a rare truth. Dominance wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and lethal, and in the shadows, those who might have challenged him, those still daring to think power could be contested, paused, reconsidering every move. Bumpy Johnson had spoken once more, and Harlem had listened. Morning light spilled over Harlem, but the streets still hummed with last night's tension. The whispers had grown louder, spreading like wildfire. Every caf, every corner, every speakeasy discussed the same story. Bumpy Johnson had walked into an auction dominated by Dutch Schultz and emerged unchallenged, razor in hand, commanding respect and fear alike. For Bumpy, it was quiet satisfaction. The painting was tucked safely away, but more importantly, the message had been delivered. Schultz had learned a lesson that money alone could never teach. Presence, patience, and calculated fear could bend entire rooms and entire cities to a man's will. Every movement Bumpy made now carried weight beyond the canvas he had claimed. The streets themselves seemed to yield to his authority. Even Schultz's men couldn't ignore the shift. Pride had been wounded, power questioned. They muttered among themselves, wary, cautious, realizing that their boss had lost more than a painting. He had lost the invisible authority that money could buy. Harlem's underworld had recalibrated overnight, understanding clearly who truly held influence. The neighborhood reacted as if under a spell. Shopkeepers locked their doors just a little slower, heads turning as Bumpy passed. Jazz musicians played softer tunes, the rhythms tempered by respect rather than fear of disruption. Children in the streets paused, sensing something intangible but powerful in the air. Every eye in Harlem, from alleyways to rooftops, watched him, or at least knew of him, and calculated accordingly. The painting itself became a symbol far larger than its frame. It was more than art, it was proof. Proof that Bumpy Johnson could outwit, outmaneuver, and dominate without firing a single shot. Its presence in his hands was a quiet proclamation. Power is controlled by precision, patience, and fear, a hierarchy that money could never overturn. Schultz, meanwhile, retreated to his private haunts, simmering. He nursed wounded pride, but even he understood. He couldn't challenge Bumpy directly, not without risk. The lesson had been painfully clear. Arrogance, wealth, and bluster were powerless against a man who measured every move, whose calm masked a lethal edge, whose silence could terrify more than any shout. By nightfall, Harlem had returned to its usual rhythm, but the story of the auction lingered like smoke in the air. People didn't need to see Bumpy to understand his presence. The fear, the respect, the legend, it had woven itself into the fabric of the city. Every whisper reinforced it, every glance acknowledged it. Bumpy Johnson had not only claimed a painting, he had claimed a chapter of Harlem itself, and as he walked through the city streets, painting under his arm, he carried something more powerful than art. He carried influence, authority, control. In a city that thrived on power, respect, and survival, Bumpy Johnson had once again proven a truth that would echo for years. Some men do not need guns to command. Some men need nothing but patience, precision, and the quiet weight of presence. And tonight, Bumpy Johnson had ruled Harlem completely. The morning after the auction, Harlem buzzed with stories and speculation. Word traveled faster than any lawman or gang enforcer could track. Every corner, from the smoky jazz clubs to the sunlit stoops, carried murmurs of the event. Bumpy Johnson, razor in hand, had outmaneuvered Dutch Schultz without a single shot fired. The painting, now safely in Bumpy's possession, became more than art. It was a symbol of dominance. People spoke of the night in hushed tones, reliving the moment the auctioneer trembled, the paddle wavered, and Schultz's bravado dissolved. In every recounting, the same lesson surfaced. Power belonged to the man who commanded fear with precision, calm, and confidence. Schultz, humiliated and simmering, retreated to reassess. His men whispered about what had happened, replaying Bumpy's subtle movements, the slight smirk, the hidden razor, the cold, unwavering gaze. They realized that money and aggression could not touch a man who had mastered patience and intimidation. Schultz had underestimated Bumpy Johnson, and the consequences would linger in his mind far longer than any lost bid. In Harlem, the ripple effects were immediate. Rival gangsters tread lightly, careful to avoid direct conflict. Neighborhoods shifted subtly as respect for Bumpy grew with each retelling. Even casual passers-by, unaware of the auction's details, could sense a change in the air. The city itself seemed to acknowledge the new order. Bumpy Johnson was untouchable, a force whose presence alone dictated the rules. Back at his hideout, Bumpy studied the painting, not for its value, but for what it represented. Control, strategy, the ability to bend an entire room and, by extension, a city to his will. Every detail of the auction, every movement of Schultz, every tremor of the crowd became part of his ledger. Harlem would remember this night for years, not because of the canvas, but because of the man holding it. The auction house, once a place of wealth and prestige, now bore the memory of Bumpy's quiet dominance. The auctioneer, pale and shaken, recounted the event endlessly to anyone who would listen, emphasizing the razor, the stare, and the calm that had silenced a room full of the city's elite. The city had learned a powerful truth: fear was currency. And Bumpy Johnson had just minted it in bulk by nightfall. Harlem had returned to its rhythm, music, chatter, footsteps, but the city had changed. Stories of the auction traveled faster than any train, spreading across blocks and boroughs. People spoke in whispers, knowing better than to challenge a man who ruled not with bullets, but with precision, patience, and presence. Bumpy walked the streets alone, painting under his arm, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm. He didn't need to flaunt victory, the city already knew. Every glance, every whisper, every cautious step taken by others acknowledged the man who had rewritten the rules of power. Harlem itself seemed to bend subtly in his favor, streets and shadows aligned with his quiet authority. And Dutch Schultz? He had learned a lesson the hard way. Wealth could not buy fear, arrogance could not intimidate, and a single man with patience, strategy, and resolve could command respect that no sum of money could equal. Bumpy Johnson vanished into the night, leaving a trail of awe and silence behind him. The painting was just a canvas, but the real masterpiece had been the demonstration of power. In Harlem, everyone would remember this night, the night a man walked in, raised his hand, and changed the balance of an entire city. Some men fight with guns. Some men fight with words. Bumpy Johnson fought with presence. And tonight, presence had won.